excited to be here to talk with you about Parenthood and this film. The Babadook is 10 years old this year, and there's lots of reasons, if you love horror, that make this one worth rewatching. You know, it's amazing acting by Essie Davis and then 6-year-old Noah Wiseman. It's got fascinating sets and pacing and lighting design, and all done on a relatively modest Kickstarter-funded budget. And then there was the fact that the Babadook unexpectedly and somewhat inexplicably became an icon of queer culture well after the movie's release. The thing I'm eager to talk about here today is not something that often gets discussed in relationship to the Babadook, but it's something that I think is really at the heart of what makes it really terrifying, and that is all the ways that this movie goes against how society expects a mother to behave according to her biological destiny. In a 2014 interview, director Jennifer Kent said this: "We would all like to think that every mother comes into the world with this innate sense of love for their offspring, but it's disturbingly common for women to struggle with that. I've seen every woman that I know say, 'I wish I was a better mother,' and feel like they're not a good mother, even if they're an extraordinary mother." She said with the Babadook, she was hoping to explore what she called the shadow side of motherhood. And boy, did she. Before we ever see the Babadook on screen, Amelia has ticked off many taboos of motherhood. She is a mother who has sexual desires, who feels rage toward her child, who shirks her ceaseless caregiving responsibilities to go buy herself an ice cream cone, who wishes her child were different than he is, who regrets having a child, and worse, says it out loud. The Babadook rejects the idea of an innate, automatic, distinctly female maternal instinct, an idea that is both a comfort and a trap. This movie's slow build and shifting sympathies makes us see in ourselves the potential to be the tired mother, the grieving mother, even the monstrous mother. Before we dig into it, I want to just note I'm going to talk about some of the social pressures that shape Amelia's experience of motherhood. I want to be really clear that how she treats her son in the movie, particularly the second half, is not normal. She is deeply traumatized, isolated, ill, and ultimately abusive. Postpartum Support International is one really good resource if you know of families who are struggling. And I shouldn't really have to give this caveat, right, to talk about a fictionalized mother in a horror film. It seems silly, but I do, and I think the reasons why will become a little bit clearer by the time we're done here. So 10 years ago, as the Babadook was just terrifying audiences for the first time, I was about to become a mother myself. My son Hartley was born in 2015. He was a little bit on the small side, and I worried about him. I worried about his growth and about my own capacity to care for him, to give him what he needed. And I worried that the fact that I wasn't feeling sort of overwhelmed by warmth and carried forward through this difficult time by a kind of certainty meant that something in me was missing or broken. Because I'm a journalist and information is really my coping mechanism, I started reading the science on the parental brain. I felt two things. I felt really comforted by the science. Some of what I was experiencing, at least, was a result of this powerful adaptation to parenthood that I was going through, and I felt really angry. I wondered why I hadn't known about this sooner, why it wasn't part of my prenatal education or any of the books that I read to prepare for parenthood, why it wasn't part of our cultural conversation about what it means to become a mother. And I realized that this was in part because we have this other story that really takes precedent, that says that mothers have all that they need, right from the start, that women have an inborn and automatic capacity for caregiving, and that this idea is based in science. And it's not. In reality, the idea of a maternal instinct comes from longstanding religious and moral ideas about what a mother is and what a woman is that were written into scientific theory by men in the early part of the 20th century. As science began to compete with religion as a means for organizing our understanding of ourselves and the world around us, some women saw the potential to use it to challenge ideas, old injustices, right? Ideas that were put upon them. But they were shut out of science, that they were shut out of medical schools and higher education, and even like kind of the civil societies for scientific exploration were shunned and shut down ultimately in many cases. Instead, the same old ideas about them were codified in scientific theory. Charles Darwin wrote that a woman's compulsion toward caregiving was the very thing that made her intellectually inferior to man. Women were specialized to care and men to compete, which allowed men to achieve higher eminence in virtually all things. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, women were vying for the right to vote and to own property. Men in power were worried about possible falling birth rates, particularly among white women in the context of rising immigration in the United States. And a woman's biology became a tool both for maintaining the status quo and amplifying a woman's role at home. This might sound familiar, what's happening today. Following in the footsteps of early naturalists, early psychologists were in the process of listing out human behaviors that developed by instinct, meaning through fixed patterns of behavior that were universal across the species. Maternal instinct was listed as the most powerful among them. William James, who was a grandfather of psychology, described maternal instinct as capable of contemning every danger, triumphing over every difficulty, outlasting all fatigue. And in 1908, William McDougall wrote that a mother's instinct to cherish and protect her children becomes her all-absorbing occupation to which she devotes all her energies, even stronger, he said, than fear itself, but not stronger than a woman's education. In fact, McDougall wrote that maternal instinct declines with intelligence, except where society holds fast to social sanctions such as bans on birth control and divorce that keep gender roles in place. McDougall was a racist and a eugenicist. This is not my judgment, it's a fact. Deeply worried about the birth rate. A subtext of his writing on maternal instinct was the maintenance of white supremacy. He wrote, "Those families and nations in which it weakens become rapidly supplanted by those in which it is strong." McDougall had his dissenters. In 1916, a pioneering woman psychologist named Leda Hollingworth wrote that women were compelled to believe that their highest use was as a mother through the same tools of social control that compel soldiers to go to war. The glory was magnified and the dangers were hidden. Maternal instinct, she said, was a doctrine of social control without scientific evidence. She called it a cheap device to compel women to participate in national aggrandizement. And one day, she said, it would run out. Even as the idea of characterizing human behavior through instinct really fell out of favor, or even came to be seen as anti-scientific, the notion of maternal instinct in particular was carried forward generation by generation, kind of recast and repeated by a long list of male experts. Among them was Konrad Lorenz, former member of the Nazi Party, whose work on imprinting in birds was awarded a Nobel Prize. Lorenz cast himself as an adoptive mother goose, and as such, also an expert in human maternal behavior. He made broad leaps in logic that critics would later call patently shallow. As science historian Marga Vicedo describes in her book, The Nature and Nurture of Love, Lorenz was fond of using a lock and key metaphor. Instinctive behaviors were the result of inherited impulses that built up in designated areas of the brain until an animal encounters a particular stimulus that triggers the release of a set action. Lorenz's work profoundly influenced John Bowlby, who is the father of attachment theory, and who emphasized that it was not only a mother's behavior that served as a key to unlock her child's development, but specific feelings of maternal warmth, as important as vitamins and nutrients. Attachment theory is not settled science, despite its popularity in pop science, but it is a foundational framework that much of the research of maternal and child development is based on, often treating the mother-infant dyad as kind of a unit in space, separate from their families, their social context, their communities. Of course, human brains are not all locks and keys. They're more like this. This is the Scarborough Marsh, which is not far from my home in Maine. A marsh is always changing. Water moves through it, picking soil and nutrients and flora and fauna up from one place, depositing it somewhere else. And then a storm comes and the change is big. Fresh water floods in from the land. A storm surge brings in salt water from the sea. A piece of the marsh folds in on itself. Another piece is washed away entirely. And when the storm settles, whole sections of the marsh can be changed in salinity, having cascading effects for the rest of the ecosystem. The landscape is remodeled. What we understand about the human brain today is that it's kind of like a marsh, ever-changing. The plasticity or moldability that we once thought ended in childhood goes on. And researchers describe parenthood, particularly new parenthood, as a kind of major storm for the brain. The hormonal shifts a person experiences during pregnancy are extreme. Progesterone increases 15 times what it was pre-pregnancy. Estradiol, 300 times. Oxytocin and prolactin surge at childbirth. It's thought that those things prime the brain, readying it to receive a baby who, with its relentless needs, its cries and coos and smells, is a powerful stimuli for the brain. The research into the parental brain is somewhat young, but what we've learned from 60 years in animal literature and about 2 decades of human brain imaging is that the brains of involved parents undergo significant functional and structural changes, and that these changes seem to be responsive, developing in coordination with our particular child and their particular needs. For birthing parents in the early postpartum weeks, researchers have found heightened activity and connectivity in brain regions involved in motivation, meaning-making, vigilance, and working memory. Babies need us to pay attention in order for them to survive, so they capture our attention. And when we give it to them, we learn quickly how to read their needs, how to adjust our responses as they are growing and changing. In the beginning, that heightened responsiveness can feel really intense, even like deliberately colored by worry. Over time, it's thought that these things shift to a more regulated state. Parents fine-tune their ability to recognize a child's cues and predict their needs. Studies looking at the architecture of the brains of mothers, comparing pre-pregnancy and postpartum scans, have found significant changes in gray matter volume, especially in brain regions related to theory of mind. Many of these changes are still present up to 6 years postpartum, which is about as far as they've looked. Other studies have looked at imaging from tens of thousands of people using big data banks in Australia and Europe, and they compare parents and non-parents of similar ages. These are older adults well past their childbearing years, and they found that parents' brains are what the researchers call younger looking, which makes sense. We tell retirees to do crossword puzzles, to stay involved in their community, to seek out cognitive challenges, excuse me. And Parenthood is full of them. It's full of complex social and cognitive challenges that are kind of never ending, right? And this tells a very different story than the one we're often told about the forgetful, frazzled woman suffering from mommy brain. There are so many questions about the parental brain that are yet to be answered. One of them is when exactly these changes unfold. You may have seen headlines about this study. It just came out, looking at one woman's brain across pregnancy and into the early postpartum period. Her brain was imaged 26 times in all. And the big takeaway here is that it confirmed a lot of what researchers have been hypothesizing so far and added some detail to it. But what's so cool about this is open access data, and it kind of was like a test case, I guess, of how to do this imaging across pregnancy, which it didn't seem possible previously. And researchers are going to take this and really start to build new studies off of it, figure out what the next questions are that they want to ask. So what about fathers and other parents? This is another area where we need a lot more research, but what's out there is fascinating, basically showing that while pregnancy is its own really powerful physiological experience, fathers and likely other non-gestational parents go through very similar changes ultimately because they also experience significant shifts in hormones, and they're exposed to babies who are these really powerful stimuli for the brain. The idea that Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy has developed she calls it TIP, which is time in proximity. Hrdy is a pioneering anthropologist and primatologist whose work really has shaped our understanding of maternal behavior. Her name, by my count, is the most cited of anyone in the parental brain research. And she just came out with this book that looks across species and at the human paternal brain science, and really comes to this conclusion that she was wrong like early on, that she thought that what mothers did was so distinctive, and she sees it in fathers also. She says, "My unexpected finding is that inside every man there lurk ancient caregiving tendencies that render a man every bit as protective and nurturing as the most committed mother." So what does all of this mean when taken together? It means that there is no sort of snap-on maternal instinct, no key to unlock the circuit. Mothers are not pre-made, no parent is. We grow with our babies through bi-directional brain development. Our parental brains grow out of the brains we already have in the context of all we are currently experiencing. That means that support matters a lot. It is normal to need help through this really profound developmental stage. This is a fact that should shape our politics and culture around parenthood. And yet, as just one example, here's a map of mandated paid leave policies by country, this one for maternity leave. And you can see that as of last year, the United States is one of 7 countries without a federal paid leave policy. Most of the others are tiny island nations. Almost all have at least 12 weeks, with Canada, most of Europe, Russia, India, Iran, Chile, others with 24 weeks or more. There's more variation with paternity leave, but you'll see that many countries have figured out how to do better than the US, which offers none. So why aren't we doing better? I think it's because this notion of maternal instinct, as Lita Hollingworth said it, remains a really important tool for social control. And if you want proof of this, all you have to do is ask anyone who writes about motherhood on the internet and see what kinds of things are said about them, the vehemence with which their work is challenged. An excerpt of my book ran in the New York Times just before it was published and received huge backlash. The one about me eating my own children is particularly interesting. Elon Musk weighed in a couple of times. In preparing, this has been revived every so few months. The commentators will post a link to just the picture of the headline so that people can't read the whole thing to see what I actually said. It was just done again recently by Nicole Shanahan, who is the Silicon Valley attorney and former running mate of RFK Jr. She said, thinking like mine will only lead to nihilism and a junky, manic mental state. The science is important, and what we do with it matters. It's a choice. Before we move on to being terrified by a children's book, I wanted to share one that includes a mother who we never actually share, but who, for me, has become an icon of real parenting. The book is Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, and my two boys are a lot like Max, mischief makers, ever pushing the boundaries of what our household or our cat can tolerate. And I know the feeling, like Max's mother, of rage overflowing at the end of the day as I'm just trying to keep it together and make dinner. As the story goes, she sends him to bed without his supper, and Max's imagination carries him off to a land of wild things where he is king, until he gets lonely and hungry and travels back to his very own room where his dinner waits for him, and it is still hot. I imagine Max's mother feeling her anger subside and a tenderness rising up instead. I imagine she takes him a tray, and there he is asleep on his bed, still in his monster suit. She pushes back the sweaty hair and kisses his forehead before going back to the dishes. Mothering is not automatic. Parenting is full of mistakes and striving to do better. When we reject these old ideas about what a mother is, we get to see that it is so much about thinking and growth and choice. As parents, we choose over and over again whether to reach toward our children or to turn away from them. We choose as a society whether to hold up families through this time of tumult or not. That choice opens us up to so much vulnerability and so much potential for beauty. Thanks so much for listening.